Welcome back to 49cc Scoot and the TMAX 500 service series. My name's Brent, and today I'm going to be working on the brakes as well as a few other things. I'm going to start off by changing the gear oil, and then I'll remove the wheels and tires to do some further checks. For those of you that have been following this entire series, you're probably going to notice that you've sort of gone back in time because the wheels and tires have been off the scooter for quite a while. That's just done because I wanted to keep everything together regarding the brake system in one video. I just wanted to clean the area under the cover up while I'm right here with just a little bit of degreaser and old toothbrush. And just in case you're wondering, all this stuff that you see all around here, that is from my paint being eaten by salt. I live in an area where they salt the roads, but that's actually not what started this. My favorite place to ride is a swamp area, and a lot of times the roads are flooded over, so you end up running through salt water or brackish water, and I would always make sure that as soon as I got home I would just hose it off. I wouldn't necessarily give it a full bath, but I would at least spray the scooter off. But apparently I didn't do that one time, and then it sat for a long time, and the next time I came back to it I looked, and this is what my paint looks like in the areas where the salt splashed. My wheels, the finish on them is messed up, and I've got corrosion on everything. So if you've seen me taking off screws and bolts from the bottom of this scooter and you notice that they're really rusty, I didn't have any of that before then. So if you like to ride anywhere where there's salt, make sure you clean that thing up before you put it away. Now I'm going to take off the rear brake caliper and the rear wheel because I want to do some brake checks and I want to do some cleanup in the area. This is my rear axle and the collar, or basically the spacer for the rear wheel. In the past I sanded these down a bit and then polished them. I thought it looked cool. They rusted, so I sanded them again, polished them, and then clear coated them with a clear coat for metal. You can see they still rusted, so this time I'm just going to sand them down in the lathe real quick, and then I'll put some just regular black paint on there. This area is so dirty, and normally you can't access it to clean it, so I'm going to go ahead and soak this with some degreaser, let that sit in for a while I do something else, and then I'll come back here and try to scrub it. Here I'm checking the thickness of all rotors, front and rear, with a micrometer. You can use calipers, those will actually work fine, they're accurate enough for this, but a lot of calipers are totally flat and you don't want to use those because you may measure the thickest sections of the brake rotor and not catch the thinnest sections. The rear rotor measures 4.5 millimeters with a 4.5 millimeter service limit, and there are obvious grooves in there, so I definitely want to replace that. Both front rotors measure 3.8 millimeters with a 3.5 millimeter service limit, and I don't see grooving or cracking, so they could likely last for at least a couple of oil changes before needing replacement based on thickness. I also check deflection for all rotors by placing a dial indicator perpendicular to the rotor and rotating the wheel. I think of this more as a runout check, or more specifically a lateral runout check, but the manual says that if you find deflection, then what you should do to try to correct it before replacing the rotor is to take all of the bolts out of the rotor, rotate the rotor on the wheel by one bolt hole, and then reinstall the bolts or install new bolts, retorque in a crisscross pattern, and then check deflection again. So apparently they're worried about the way the rotor or the disc actually sits on the wheel and how it's torqued, creating deflection. I never bothered to check the rear disc because I know that's going to be replaced anyway, but I did check both front rotors, and those both came out to 4 thousandths to 5 thousandths of an inch of deflection with a spec of 6 thousandths of an inch, so they're fine based on that as well. It looks like I should be fine without replacing the front rotors for a while, but I'm still considering replacing them anyway, because one of my major goals when I did this service was, since I'm going to be diving so deep into this, I've got the thing so far apart, I wanted to try and take care of anything that I could at least predict coming up within, say, 10,000 miles or more. I don't need to do a whole lot of inspection to the brake pads in my case, because for me, if I replace discs, I'm always going to replace the pads with those. So I already know these are junk regardless of what they show. However, even in that circumstance, it's good to look at both of the brake pads in each one of the calipers and make sure that there's not uneven wear from side to side. So for example, if I see that one of these is much thinner than the other one, I know that there's got to be something else going on. Maybe my piston is sticking inside of the caliper and that needs attention, or maybe I've got a bad brake hose. But I definitely need to investigate further if I find that one of these is significantly thinner than the other. If you don't already know that you're discarding your brake pads, then you want to be more thorough with the inspection. So the first thing is the thickness of the friction material right here, and you want to check that on both of these. Now, to do a thorough check or inspection of these, you'll actually need to remove them from here, which I will show you later because I'm going to be replacing these. I'll just show you the whole disassembly and reassembly process all at once later on in the video. But you can do a lot of the checks without even disassembling anything. In this case, I could do a pretty decent check because of the gap in here without ever taking these apart. So the service limit on these is 0.8 millimeters of thickness. That's very obvious that these are thicker than that. But you can still do a quick measurement of each one. That one's about 7.2 and that one's about 7.1, so they're not too far off. That's not alarming to me, and obviously again well over any limitation there. The other thing is just to make sure that there's no damage and that the surfaces of each one look good. So sometimes these will crumble around the edges. If you see that, then you need to replace those. And you also need to check both surfaces and make sure those are nice and flat and smooth. If those are all gouged up, scored up, or have any kind of damage or anything embedded in them, then you'll want to replace both of the brake pads. But again, I will show you the full disassembly and reassembly of this later on in the video. I also need to check the brake hoses, lines, and connections. So, brake hoses are the rubber parts here, like this. With brake hoses, you want to check the entire length of the hose for any sort of damage, wear, maybe chafing, like something's been rubbing up against it, any bulges in the hose, or any cracking. And for cracking, what I like to do is just bend the hose and then check it over after it's bent, and usually it'll be easier to see cracks when it's bent. If you see any of that stuff, you should replace them. If you follow the service manual's guidelines, what you'll see is that under brake hoses, they tell you to replace those every 4 years. So that doesn't matter if they pass all the other checks. Regardless of their condition, they want them replaced every 4 years just as a safety measure. And I can tell you that most people do not do that. My scooter is currently 10 years old, so I'm well beyond that. And it doesn't really worry me because the hoses and lines all look fine. Nothing's leaking, nothing's cracked, nothing's damaged. No issues that I can see. But because these things are 10 years old, and because I'm trying to avoid any future issues, I'd really rather not take this thing apart for quite a while. I am considering doing the brake hoses, but I'm going to have to price them out and make a decision probably based on that. If you follow the path of the rubber hoses, you'll see that they eventually meet up with metal lines like this here. So the metal ones are very simple to check. You're basically just looking to make sure that they're not kinked or damaged in any way, you don't see any leaks, and that they're not all rusty. Unfortunately, I can't really show this to you, but if I hold the balancer rod on this setup still and then spin this tire kind of quickly, I can feel a little bit of a bump as it goes around. And I also noticed that it's very hard when I didn't have it on the balancer to rotate the wheel bearings by hand, or actually I couldn't get them to rotate by hand, but I don't notice any markings on the axle to tell me that they're spinning on the axle or anything weird going on. So I think it's about time for the bearings to be replaced, and I guess I'm going to throw them in the order with my rear brake whenever I get it. Before I move on, I think I'm going to go ahead and remove the stuff that I know is bad. So I'm going to get the seal and the wheel bearings out of the front, and I will take that rotor or disc off of the rear. Now that it's not on the balancer, watch. I cannot rotate the center of these bearings by hand. And you can actually see it looks like the seal's a little messed up on that bearing right around there. Same deal on the other side. Again, I cannot rotate. Well, there it goes. It's really tough to rotate by hand. I did manage to move it then, and now I can't get it to move again. But yeah, I think they may actually be jammed up against the separator, divider, whatever, the spacer inside of there a little bit too much. It seems like they're jammed up against each other so hard that it's actually trying to seize them up. I'm just going to do this the old-fashioned way and try to hammer them out. Before I do that, I'm going to put some blocks of wood down under the tire because I don't want the wheel lying on the brake rotor. In order to use a punch to drive these out, I need to be able to grab an edge of one of these bearings. Going through this way, I'm going to try to grab the edge of the bearing on the other side. But the spacer in there is very well aligned. So what I'm going to do is move this down in there at an angle until I can feel the edge, till I'm pushing right up against the bearing. It's not enough that I can catch it and hammer it out, but I'm going to give this a couple of light taps in one direction. And that should move my spacer a little bit out of the way, so I'll be able to catch an edge down there now. With that side out, the other side's easy. Got a nice clear shot through there. So I can just use a larger punch and go ahead and knock that out. Again, the tire and wheel are on my wooden block, so I'm not putting the pressure on the brake. Yow! You should use a longer punch because that hurts like. I measured this spacer that goes through the front wheel between the two bearings, and I measured the distance between the bearing seats, and this thing seems like it's a bit long for that. Now, there is nothing to hold it other than being pressed between the two bearings, so I know it needs to be a bit of a press fit or a tight fit in there, kind of squeezed in between the two. However, there's damage on one end a little bit, so I feel like this thing is being squeezed a bit too hard, and that is not great for the bearing. So I'm just going to shave a really, really tiny amount off of the end of this. Not the kind of thing I would suggest that anyone else does, but I'm going to give it a try. It's just an aluminum tube, so if I mess it up, I can make another one. Like I said, I barely took anything off of there. About 1/1000th of an inch. So I don't even know that it's really going to make any change at that rate. But I don't think it's going to hurt anything. Now back to the present. I've got some wheel bearings and seals in from Yamaha, and then I went on scootertuning.ca for some of my brake parts. I did have to order, I believe it was the front brakes from another site, because apparently Malossi, I don't know if they've discontinued these or just nobody has them, but I found one site that had them in stock, and otherwise seems like nobody could get them. So I got some Malossi front brake rotors, brake discs. I got Malossi rear brake rotor. All the pads for the front and rear from Malossi, these are all sintered. And I also decided to go ahead and replace my brake lines and brake hoses with Malossi. So I've got all stainless brake hoses, as well as the hardware and instructions that came with that from Malossi. If you haven't checked out scootertuning.ca by now, you really should. They've got parts for scooters large and small. They offer very competitive pricing, fast shipping, and great customer service. Thanks again to those guys. Now I'm going to remove both of these brake rotors, then I'll replace the wheel bearings, and then install the new rotors. That thing is on there. Alright, this one's decided it's not coming out. I've got a 1/4 inch, which is just slightly larger. See if that works. Try to tap that in. I don't think that's going to be big enough to work. Slipped right out. Because of it being kind of dome shaped, I can't seem to get anything to grab a hold of this. It just wants to slip off. I'm going to do something a bit more drastic now and see if I can get this to rotate with a chisel. Can't tell if I'm just destroying the whole thing or if it rotated at all. I think I'm just destroying it. Let's see if this works. I just TIG welded a bolt in there. If you watch my other videos, you know I'm not very good with TIG welding. But I figured that would give me a better chance than the flux core, because I don't want to get spatter all over this wheel or put too much heat in there. And it looks like I didn't manage to even damage the paint or anything, so I should be good. Now I can put a socket on there and hopefully this comes out. Or it appears that I'm just bending this bolt, which is ridiculous. Now I'm wondering how this thing was put in there. Did somebody use permanent thread locker or JB weld? Because I think I'm twisting the head off of this bolt, which is really not good. Well, let's go for it. Yeah, the whole bolt is twisting. And that's not turning. There we go. That was easy. Just looks like standard blue thread locker. Let's hope we do better on this side. Oh boy. Here we go again. This time 2 out of 6 stripped. Last time 1 out of 6, so that's 3 out of 12. That's 25% have stripped out. That's really not very good. I'm not going to reuse any of those old bolts after seeing how much trouble a few of them were. I went ahead and ordered bolts, but in the meantime, I've cleaned this wheel up the best I can. Unfortunately, all this dull looking stuff is where corrosion's got the best of it, and all this is also corrosion. So salt water's done a number on so much stuff on this bike. But anyway, while I'm waiting, I'm going to go ahead and get the wheel bearings installed. So I did make sure I got the races in here where the wheel bearing set very clean. These could be driven in, but I've got a press, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. And to begin with, I'm going to set this bearing down in here. I'm going to start off with a block of wood. That's as far as it's going to go right now. I'm still going to need to push this down deeper. So now I've got a bearing and seal driver that's just a little bit smaller than the outside of the bearing, and I'll use that to finish. I want to make sure I get this seated all the way down, and I didn't quite make it the first time. I'll give it another shot here. There we go. Bottoming out. Now I can look in from the other side and I can tell that that bearing is indeed all the way up against its seat. Before the next bearing goes in, I've got to put the spacer in. It should just drop down in the center. And I want to try to center that so that the spacer aligns with the holes in the bearings. Now I've got light pressure on there, so I'm going to go ahead and release this. I'm actually going to use my axle, make sure it fits, where I can easily wiggle it around. Okay, I can get this realigned, and I'll finish pressing that in until it stops. Now that they're both in, I'm going to take my axle, make sure that's still aligned, which it is. You can look and make sure these are seated on both sides. And then make sure that both of these rotate freely. This side of the wheel needs a new seal as well. The other side has the speedometer assembly to go on there. So I'm going to go ahead and grease this. I'll use a seal driver. And that's down there flush now. Initially I planned to replace all of these bolts with Yamaha parts, but I looked around at the Yamaha part sites, and to get 18 bolts I could do all front and rear is about $85 to $90 with tax and shipping, and that seemed kind of ridiculous to me. So I looked around some more, and these are the same part numbers as the Yamaha R1 and R6 brake bolts, and those are much more popular models in the US. So when I looked for that, I found these on Amazon, which came out to, I believe it was about $70 after tax, and these are titanium bolts. These are a good match for the stock bolts, and they weigh about 4.5 grams, where the stock bolts are just shy of 8 grams. I'm going to clean these off with a little bit of brake parts cleaner before I install them. The bolts should have a little bit of medium strength thread locker applied, and these need to be installed and torqued in a crisscross pattern in stages. So the final torque is 13 foot-pounds. I'm going to do the first stage as finger tight, then I will do 6.5 foot-pounds, and then 13. Now I need to make sure some things are ready before I install the wheel. So I've got to have my axle handy. You should check that out, make sure there's no damage to it, and clean it up. There's also a collar. I went over this lightly with some sandpaper just to make sure it was nice and smooth and there were no gouges. Then there's this speed sensor. You should be able to grab these two prongs and pull this piece out. You want to clean this up very thoroughly and clean this section up as well. I just used a basic general purpose degreaser. I use a little bit of grease to go around the inside of this piece and a little bit of grease on the outside. And then that can go back into the other part. Just make sure that moves smoothly. Now this collar can slide into the seal. That's on the right side of the wheel. A pinch bolt goes here in the bottom of the front fork. Make sure that is either very loose or totally removed as I have mine. Alright, so now make sure the wheel is in the proper orientation. The side with the seal in this collar should be the right side, or if you're on the front of it, it's actually going to be on your left. Go ahead and put that roughly into position here. Now I'm going to pick this up and try to align everything so I can get the axle started. Now the wheel should be far enough back for the wire from the speed sensor to reach it, so you can go ahead and install that, and just make sure these tabs align with the two tabs that you can see inside of there. It should sit flush all the way around and turn easily. Before you can get the axle all the way through, there's a little groove here on the speed sensor hub that I'm pointing to right now, and on the inside of this fork is a little nub, and that nub on the inside of this has to align with that groove. If everything's aligned properly, once you're finished, the speed sensor hub should be locked into place with this fork so you can't rotate it around anymore. Now I can move back over to this side and start threading the axle in. If it doesn't start right away, you might have to kind of pick up or move the other side around a little bit until it does. This gets torqued to 52 foot-pounds. Now this pinch bolt can go in and be torqued to 14 foot-pounds. There's still plenty of work to do to the front brakes, but I want to get the rear wheel and tire on there as well. I'd just like to be able to see this thing with both its feet on the ground again. It's been a long time. So I've gone ahead and cleaned up the wheel and tire the best I can. Again, I've got corrosion everywhere and there's nothing I can do about that, unfortunately. I also cleaned all the old grease out of this center section with a toothbrush and some degreaser. So I'm ready to get the rear brake disc installed, and that's going to be the same process as the front, so I'm not really going to walk you through that. It's even the exact same torque specs. I'm going to put some fresh grease in here on these splines and then the wheel will be ready. I also need to get some stuff ready back here, starting with this gear. So first I'm going to go ahead and pull out this little spacer, set that aside. And then I'm going to spray this gear with some parts cleaner. And scrub it with a toothbrush until I can get all that old grease off of there. The spacer's got some rust on it, so I'm going to go ahead and clean it off real quick with a little bit of parts cleaner. Still got rust on it and feels a bit rough, so I'm going to go over it real quick with some 400 grit sandpaper, and then I'll clean it off again and reinstall it. I've also got some rust here in this hole where the axle goes through the swing arm, so I'm going to use some 400 grit sandpaper and try to clean that out as well. Then I'll make sure this pinch bolt is either removed or very loose. It's time to put the wheel on, so make sure you've got the axle, this collar, and then you should have the axle washer and nut as well. I'm going to insert this collar into the seal, but I almost forgot that I want to put a little bit of fresh grease inside of that seal first. Now I'm going to hold this collar in place while I pick the wheel up, and I have to get it started on the splines that are on the opposite side of the wheel over here. Then I put my axle through. Now I can slide the washer on and get the axle nut started. Now I'm going to use a 17mm hex or Allen socket inside of the end of the axle. I'm going to set my ratchet to on, and then I'm going to rest the handle of the ratchet against the ground, and that way this will hold it for me while I try to tighten the nut on the other side. And this should be torqued to 75 foot-pounds. Now the pinch bolt gets torqued to 12 foot-pounds. I'm going to mount the handlebars now because I think it'll come in handy when I'm trying to do the brake hoses, and definitely when I'm bleeding the brakes, to be able to have the levers mounted up here on the bars. These are just going on temporarily. I'll have to move them into their proper positions later when I'm installing the rest of the controls on the handlebars. Now I've got quite a bit of stuff that I'd like to replace somewhat together. So I've got the stainless steel brake lines here from Malossi, as well as all the fittings that go with those. I've got new front and rear brake pads, again Malossi. I picked up the new hardware from Yamaha, the brake springs and the support pads, because you should replace those when you do the pads. And one thing I hadn't talked about before is this kit here. This is a brake caliper piston seal kit. So these are seals for the pistons that are inside of the calipers. Yamaha says that these seals should be replaced every 2 years, the same timing that you should do your brake fluid. Now, I've never done the seals in this, and I would be pretty sure that no one ever has on this bike, and it's 10 years old, so I just decided it's about time that I do it, sort of similar to what I'm doing with the brake hoses. I started off by looking at Yamaha parts, and as has been the case with a lot of things here, I found that Yamaha parts can be pretty expensive, and sometimes you don't even know when you're going to be able to get a hold of them because they're out of stock. So then I went and looked around and found this alternative. This is from Brake Crafters. I actually got it from their eBay site, but they've got a website of their own as well. Kit is BC21S. This is a complete front seal kit. So it's got all the seals, it's got the grease that they want you to put on the seals, and it even comes with new bleeder valves and crush fittings for those. I would like to do the rear, but Yamaha is the only place I can find the rear seal kit, and I've got them ordered, but currently I don't know exactly when I'm going to get them. It may be a while, so I'm probably not going to show the rear brake seal replacement in this video. However, once you see me do the front, then you should be able to do the rear if you wanted to do that on your own. I'm going to work with one system at a time. So I'll begin with the rear brakes. I'll do the rear brake pads, hardware for those, and I'll do the rear brake stainless steel hoses and fittings. I'll put new fluid in there and bleed that out, and then once all of that's finished, then I'll move on to the front brake. I want to make things as easy as I can for myself once I start moving, so I'll go ahead and sort this stuff out now. I know that these are my rear brake pads. These are the new support pads for the rear brake. And then with the brake hoses, Malossi tells you that the ones with clamps, which are cable ties, are the ones for the rear brakes. I'm going to go a step further with sorting things out before I start and figure out which brake hose goes where. So I want to match these up because one is clearly shorter than the other one is, and I also want to make sure it looks like they fit before I get started with this. The rear brake system has two hoses. It has one that goes from the master cylinder down to this connection here up front, and it has one that goes from this fitting all the way back to the caliper here in the rear. And this is definitely the shorter of the two, so I've got the shorter of the two hoses supplied by Malossi, and it appears that that should match up well with this one. I used a piece of masking tape to make a small label, and that'll tell me RR, it's the rearmost of the rear cables. And I'll do the same kind of check here up front, just going to make sure it looks like that should fit. And that looks good. The first thing I want to do is try to get all of the fluid out of the rear brake system. So I'm going to start by removing the master cylinder cap and trying to draw some of this out. But before I do that, I'm putting some rags around because brake fluid is very harsh on anything painted and many coated surfaces. Now I will say that you'll find many different ways to remove brake fluid. This is just the way that I'm going to do it, but there are a lot of ways that will work. So to remove this cap, I would suggest that you get a JIS, Japanese Industrial Standard, I believe it is, screwdriver instead of just a plain Phillips, because these things can be very easy to strip, and those are a much better fit on these screws. I'm going to pull as much as I can get out of here with my syringe. I got most of it, but I'll wipe the rest out and make sure it's clean in there with a couple of rags. There's still brake fluid in the hoses, the line, and in the caliper itself, and I want to get as much of that out of there as I can. Again, there are many ways to do this. The way that most people are going to do it, remove this little cover on the bleeder valve, And then you can open this, and when you open that, that will allow brake fluid to come out. But you want a receptacle for it. You don't just want to open it and let it flow out. Again, you're going to make a lot of mess that way. Put the closed end of a wrench on the bleeder valve. This one's a 10mm. And then you'll need a hose that fits securely over the nipple here. This is 3/16 ID PVC hose, and you can get this really cheap from most hardware stores. Just push that down. Since you'll be draining brake fluid out of here, you'll want some kind of container on the end of this. The easiest solution for most people is going to be to take an old soda can. You can flip this little tab up and then place your hose through there and into the can, and that'll hold it in place. Then open this bleeder valve about a quarter to a half a turn until you start seeing fluid come out of there, and that'll drain into your container. Doing it this way can take quite a while because you're relying on gravity. And you can try things like making sure this is the lowest point in the system. This bleeder valve specifically is the lowest point. That way it helps a little bit more, but you're likely going to have to give it a long time, and it may not ever get all of the fluid out of there. So one thing that some people will do is, instead of opening this right away, they'll leave it closed. You go and you pump the brake lever to build some pressure, hold the lever, open this, and that will push some fluid out, and you keep doing that until you get as much as you can. Another thing that you can do, if you've got a syringe like I just used to pull the fluid out of the master cylinder, I'm going to take my hose out of this can, and then I will attach this to the end of a syringe instead. So now I'm going to try to use my syringe to create a suction and pull some of this fluid out. Again, just make sure your bleeder valve is open when you do this. You can see that's pulling that right out of there. Another idea that uses a fairly similar method is to use one of these vacuum brake bleeding systems. So basically this is a vacuum pump with a little gauge on there so you can see the vacuum that you build when you pump it. It's got a container here to collect fluid, and then a hose that will attach to your bleeder. So I'll go ahead and attach the hose to my bleeder. My bleeder valve is currently closed. Now I'm going to pump this up to create vacuum. Hopefully, if everything's sealed, it'll hold the vacuum pretty well. Then I can open the bleeder valve, and you should see that the vacuum on here drops as it starts to pull fluid out of the system. Normally, if you were bleeding the brakes, you would want to make sure that you close this bleeder valve before this gauge reaches 0, so no vacuum, just so you don't introduce any air into the lines. In this case, it doesn't really matter because I'm just trying to get rid of everything. So I'll go ahead and open this up. You can see it's pulling the fluid out, the vacuum is dropping. You can try to keep pumping it, or you can close it, build up more vacuum, and keep repeating this process until you get all of that fluid out of there. Regardless of what method you use, before you call it done, I would suggest turning this upside down so that the bleeder really is the total lowest point in the system. Make sure you've got vacuum on the system, or use your syringe or whatever you're doing, and then open it up and you may get a little more fluid out. After you're confident that you've got all the fluid you can out, make sure your bleeder valve is closed, and then you can remove the hose from the nipple. At this point, I should have as much brake fluid out of there as I'm going to get out of there. So I'm getting ready to remove this bolt to remove the hose from the caliper. But before I do, just in case, I am going to put a rag underneath of here and place some rags over the paint that's very nearby. Even as bad as my paint is, it could always be worse. And now I'll use an Allen socket to remove this bolt. And the hose can come off of there. Wipe up any brake fluid that spills around here. And I'm also going to wad up a little piece of paper towel here and just put it in that hole just to make sure nothing gets in there while I'm working on other stuff. Brake fittings like this are either going to have crush washers or little sealing washers. You'll see they've got a rubber seal inside. In this case, they're aluminum crush washers, and they both stayed attached to my brake hose. In this case, I'm going to toss the brake hose. They're stuck to there. That's fine with me. But you just want to make sure they're out of the way and they're not stuck to your caliper or anything like that. I want to do the brake pads and hardware next, so I have to remove these two bolts. Now normally these two bolts would be either loosened or removed before this entire assembly is removed from the scooter. When I removed this, I wasn't even thinking about doing the brakes. I just wanted to get the rear wheel off, so I didn't do that. Normally, make sure you do that before this is off. If you didn't, then you can go ahead and mount it back up to here if you have trouble getting those two bolts out. Take these at least loose or out, and then remove those bolts and take the whole assembly off again. But for now, I'm going to try to just get these bolts off of there where it sits. Now the two sections here can separate the bracket and the actual caliper. It looks like if you don't remove this whole bracket here for this parking cable, then this doesn't want to come out, but that should be just fine to leave it there. Since I don't have the piston seals, there's no point of me disassembling this any further, but I am going to go ahead and clean this up with some brake parts cleaner and some brushing just to get it ready for when it's reassembled. You'll also want to clean the pins very thoroughly as part of this process as well, or the bolts. Now that this is much cleaner, if I had the caliper seals, then I would go ahead and try to remove this piston, which they say that all you have to do is pump this lever for your parking brake and just keep pumping that, and that should force the piston all the way out. You could also use a pair of pliers and grab in these slots and then rotate this counterclockwise, and that should help pull this out of there. In my case, I don't want this piston to come further out. I actually want to push it in farther because when I install new pads that are thicker, I'm not going to be able to fit them over the brake disc unless I push this inward. So what you want to do for the rear brake is still grab it just like I said if you were trying to remove it in those two little grooves, except you're going to turn it clockwise and keep rotating it until this part here, the top, is flush with the rest of the brake caliper body. And I can tell you this does take a good bit of effort. I should mention that if you're trying to push the piston into the caliper, you need to allow pressure relief somehow. So normally what you would do is put a hose on the bleeder valve like I showed you earlier, route that to a container, and crack the bleeder valve open, and that will allow the pressure to force out of there. In my case, I'm not worried about it because I have this big opening where I don't have a hose anymore. Because this is so hard to turn, while I'm trying to turn it, I started thinking, and I realized I have a brake tool that works on many cars, and I didn't even think about it working with the motorcycle or TMAX, but it's got a bunch of different adapters for pistons like this that would need to be turned and other tasks, and it's got these squares. They're not just regular squares, they fit a 3/8 drive adapter or extension, so I can use these two, put my extension in the other side, then use a ratchet, align these with my piston, and that makes it much easier to turn this. Kind of surprised Yamaha didn't mention it or doesn't say that they offer a specialty tool for it. The piston is pretty well flush with my caliper now, and the other important thing when you're doing this is to make sure that when you stop, these two grooves are going up and down in the caliper this way, or you can look at it as one of these grooves aligns with this little sort of tab right here. And that's important because your brake pads have a little nub on the back of them, and if you don't do this, then there will be no clearance for that nub and the brake pads won't fit properly. Now I can turn my attention to the bracket that holds the brake pads. So I'm going to go ahead and get these brake pads out of here. All you've got to do is use a screwdriver or something and pop those out. I'm not worried about the pads because they'll be replaced. Then there are these small metal pieces that they call brake pad supports. Before you remove these, take note of what they look like so you can see that you've got one side where there's a tab facing up, like bent up, one where it sticks out, and also this little indentation here is closer to this side of this bracket, and this side is wider. Once you've noted all that stuff, then you can go ahead and pop those out as well. Since I didn't have the brake pads out earlier when I was talking about inspection, I wanted to show you this. So if I look at these brake pads, hopefully you can see the lights catching all these grooves in there, and I can feel those with my finger running across it. So that would be one thing that would tell me I need to replace these, and also the grooving on my rotors match, so I'm replacing the rotors and the pads. You'll also want to look for damage. Like you can see, I did this with a screwdriver, just popping them out, I believe, because I didn't care about them. But if you see any kind of damage, you want to check that out and see if it's something that's bad enough that you think they need to be replaced. And also with these out, it's a little easier to do an accurate check of the height because you can use this function of your calipers. And you can also check side to side and make sure that one side isn't way different than the other, top to bottom, etc. You'll probably notice it just by looking at it. But if you want to do these thorough inspections, you can do that while it's off. And if anything is off, say it's way thinner over here than here, or way thinner at the top than the bottom, then you'll need to do some further inspection and investigation to find out why. Now before these go back on, I'm spraying them down with some general purpose cleaner degreaser. I don't like to use brake parts cleaner on this just because they have rubber pieces in here and I don't want to dry those out. Once they're all soaked, then again, I'm going to go over and brush everything and try to clean this as thoroughly as I can. Now that this is clean, I'm about ready to install my new support pads and brake pads. The first thing I'm going to do is just spray these off with brake parts cleaner just to make sure there's no residue on there. And I will let those sit and dry as I install the clips. Before these go in, I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant into each one of the grooves where they sit. Not very much because I don't want it to be forced out and end up onto my brake pads or my brake rotor, because that could cause some serious issues with slipping. But just a little bit. I'm going to use, this is Sil-Glide brake lubricant. It's a silicone brake lubricant, and that's what Yamaha recommends, a silicone-based brake lubricant. So just put a little on my finger here. And I'm going to smear that across here, get it on both the top and bottom ledges as well. And hopefully you can see this is not a thick coating at all. This is just a very thin coating. Do that on both sides. Before the clip goes in, make sure you're paying attention to how it goes. It really should only fit one way. But you can see on one side it's got these tabs that are bent down, and on the other side they stick out. The tabs that are bent down are going to go over here. The ones that stick out are closer to these pins. So just align these so that they go around the edges of your bracket here. Push that in and then push the bottom in. And that one's done. Same deal on the other side. Get those two upward bent tabs to go around your bracket. Push that in and then push the bottom in. And I'm also going to take a very small amount of this silicone lubricant and just rub it over all the areas here facing inward on this. Couple of quick things before you install the brake pads. Number one is to clean off your hands or your gloves and make sure you don't have any lubricant on those so you don't accidentally lubricate your brake pads, the friction material. Second, take a look at the back of both of the pads. So in this case with a Malossi, you'll see that one has just a flat surface here and the other has a little nub on there. That little nub is there to interact with the piston. Remember, you saw those grooves on the piston? That will fit into one of those. Now, some brake pads are like this, and they have one nub and none. And others, I believe these were EBC that I had on there before, have nubs on each one. So in the case of those, it doesn't matter. But if you have the kind with just one nub, you want to make sure that this little pin or nub is facing the piston. So in the case of this, you want this one to be facing out this way toward these rubber pieces here. So I'm just going to go ahead and slide this one in. Should be able to push it right in there. Then I can flip this over, slide the other in the same way. Now I'm going to take a little bit of the same silicone brake lubricant, and I'm just going to rub that across the back of these. And again, this is one of those things, some people say you should do it, some people say you shouldn't. I've always done it this way, and it's always worked fine for me. When you finish up, take a quick look, make sure there's no lubricant on the friction material of your brake pads. If there is, go ahead and clean that off with brake parts cleaner. Next, I want to install my caliper into my caliper bracket. So the first thing that I'm going to do is lubricate this bolt that's kind of stuck in here again because I didn't remove this bracket with some silicone grease. And then I'm going to try to start that into this part right here, the rubber piece. And I'm going to have to kind of twist it around again because it's stuck in the caliper itself. I'm going to push that up there, and then I'll kind of rotate this up so that it can all fit together. I can get this bolt started. I'm not going to tighten it all the way, I'm just going to get it started in there. Now I'm going to take my other bolt and apply grease to that as well, or silicone lubricant. And you can be pretty liberal with these. Then I can get this aligned and slide this bolt through that rubber and into the caliper bracket and get that started as well. I won't be torquing these all the way down until I've got this whole assembly installed onto the engine because it's a lot easier that way. I'm going to take a look at the underside of this, and I'm going to try to gently create space for my brake rotor just by pushing the pads out all the way up against this stop here and all the way up against the piston. And now you can see I've got plenty of room for that to fit over my brake disc. Now I can get this into position, make sure my pads are going over my brake rotor around it, slide this down, and then get my bolts started. Now this bolt and this bolt will be torqued to 29 foot-pounds. These two will be torqued to 22 foot-pounds. Next up, I'm going to replace this rearmost brake hose. So this side of the hose is already disconnected from the caliper from earlier. I've just got to work on this end. Even though I've got most of the fluid out of the system, it's very possible the brake fluid is going to come out of here when I remove this connection. So again, I'm going to go ahead and stuff a rag under here just to try and save any parts of the bike that I don't want brake fluid on. Then I'm going to need a 10mm line wrench for this fitting. You don't necessarily have to use a line wrench, but it does protect the fitting a little bit more by making more contact with it than a standard wrench. And I need a 17mm for this part of the fitting right here. So I'm going to hold the 17mm while I try to loosen the 10mm. There it goes. Now I can move my rag to the side. I'm still trying to keep it under here just in case. And there's a bolt right here for this little holder that uses a 10mm socket. I can remove that. Now you can just pry this little piece open and remove that from the hose. Then you'll need to pull one end of the hose through both of these little holders here. This is the smaller end, the one on the back, so I'm going to pull it through this way. Like a lot of other parts of this scooter, unfortunately these little holders here have got some rust, some corrosion from all the salt water. So I'm just going to brush those off real quick. I'm not going to do a real refinishing. You'd have to remove them and totally clean them up and repaint them or something if you wanted it to be right. I'm just going to try to get the worst of the rust off while I'm at it. Now I've got the hose that I had labeled as the rearmost hose. I'm going to go ahead and rip that label off. I won't need it anymore. And now I can route it through these two hangers. I'm also going to go ahead and cut off this little cable tie that they put on there. And I'm going to take this little clamp, slide that over the grommet that they have on there. Squeeze that together. I'm going to make the connection to the caliper first because this one has a sort of bent end on it and it really matters which way it goes. So if you try to install it this way, it would run into the caliper. So it needs to be oriented this way so that it clears everything. I've got a brake bolt out of the kit. All of the bolts are the same aside from one, and it has much finer threads than this. It wouldn't actually thread into this caliper. Then I've got one of the aluminum crush washers, and I'm going to put that onto the bolt all the way up against the head. Flip this around, and I'll put my bolt with the washer through there. Then I've got another crush washer that I just dropped, and I'm going to put it on the other side. So basically your brake hose is sandwiched between two crush washers. Now I'll get that in place and go ahead and get this brake bolt started into the caliper. Malossi's instructions say that if you're using their aluminum fasteners, you should not exceed 15/17 Newton meters of torque. So they don't specify which one or which fittings would be up to 17 Newton meters. So what I'm going to do is just torque everything to 15 Newton meters. On the other end, I'm going to begin by just sliding this grommet and bracket up so it's roughly in place. And then I'm going to try to get this line or this hose started onto this line. And these are aluminum fittings, so be very careful not to cross thread anything. If it doesn't feel right, just go ahead and back it off and restart it. I don't have any simple way to torque this, so I'm going to go ahead and use a 10mm line wrench and a 17mm line wrench and just snug this up so it's fairly tight. And now you can move this bracket up and go ahead and bolt that on. Before you call this part of the line finished, you may want to look at your service manual at the cable and hose routing diagrams. They will show you exactly how this should be routed through everything, even as specific as it should go under this as opposed to over that, for example. Also, make sure that there's enough slack in the line that as your swing arm is moving around, it's not going to pull this, and make sure there's nothing that's going to rub or chafe. Moving on to the front section of the hose, it's going to be a very similar process, and I'm going to start at the rearmost connection. I'm going to go ahead and put a rag under there, just in case. And I've got a 17mm and 10mm connection here. And that thing is very, very secure. There we go. There's a bracket here, just like the one in the rear had. And finally, there's a connection all the way up at the master cylinder. Again, when this comes off, you'll see there's an aluminum crush washer, the hose, and then another crush washer. So make sure all that stuff comes out. I'm going to wipe off where that fitting was and make sure it's clean and dry. Then I can remove this hose from the bike. With the new hose, I've only got this one spot that I need to route it through for now. And once again, I have to pay attention to how this is oriented. So it would look like you'd probably want this thing to go downward like this, but that's actually wrong. The stock one was installed, kind of flipped around from that, where it goes over a bit more because you want it to follow the handlebars more instead of just going straight down. Just like the last connection that I made to the caliper, I've got my bolt with one crush washer on there, slide that through, then I can put another crush washer on there, and then get this started into the master cylinder. There should be two guides here on the master cylinder, just these little pegs that hose needs to sit in between. And I'll also torque this to 15 Newton meters. And again on the other end, another connection that I'm just going to snug with 2 wrenches. And then I can put this clamp over here, squeeze that together, and move that into position and bolt it down. Check the hose from end to end to make sure there's nothing that's going to rub or chafe. Verify the routing via the service manual, and also since it's on the front end, turn the handlebars all the way left and make sure there's enough slack there, and then turn them all the way right and make sure there's still enough slack. Now everyone's favorite task of trying to fill and bleed the brake system. So there are multiple ways of doing this, just like I showed you for draining the brakes out. There's multiple ways of doing that, same here. Regardless, the first step in any of those is going to be to fill your master cylinder. In the case of the TMAX, Yamaha recommends DOT4 brake fluid. I'm not using anything fancy, just some inexpensive kind of generic brand brake fluid. The main thing that's important here is make sure it meets the proper spec like DOT4. Again, have some rags around here so you don't spill brake fluid all over everything. I'm also going to turn my handlebars and try to level that fluid out a little bit. And now I'm going to put not the entire cap, but just the rubber and plastic section back on there, just to make sure nothing squirts out of there at any point and gets all over everything else. The next steps are going to vary depending on what method you decide to try. So I'm going to start with gravity bleeding, show you what that is basically. And I'm going to need to open the bleeder valve. So first I'm going to put my wrench on here. Again, that's a 10 millimeter. And then I'm going to go back to my trusty soda can with a piece of tubing on it. I'll put that piece of tubing over top of the nipple on the bleeder valve. And then I'm just going to go ahead and open up the bleeder valve. Make sure it's open far enough. The idea here is to let gravity do the work for you. You open this up, you keep the master cylinder full, and it's very important that you monitor the master cylinder to make sure it doesn't get low, or if it gets too low, air can go into the system along with your brake fluid, and that's going to make it hard to bleed out. But you're pretty much just waiting for brake fluid to run downhill, and until you see some brake fluid start to show up at the bleeder valve here. One negative thing about gravity bleeding is that it can take quite a bit of time, and sometimes it doesn't even really want to work for you. So in a system like this, where the hose and the line, a lot of the path is just parallel to the ground pretty much. It's not a very steep downhill path. It may not even work very well at all for us. Something like the front brakes, where the master cylinder's up high and the calipers are down low and it's almost a straight shot down, you've got an even better chance of that working and working quickly. So you're going to have to be prepared to wait a while with this, and if you don't see any fluid coming out of here, then you may not even be able to rely on gravity bleeding. The next way I'll show you is with a vacuum bleeder, and that seems to be kind of the preferred method for most people these days. So I'll go ahead and remove this tube from my bleeder valve, and now I've got my vacuum bleeder that I showed you earlier. I'm going to attach the tube for it to the bleeder valve. And then basically just like I showed you to draw fluid out, I'm going to pump this up and get some vacuum in there. And once I've created a good bit of vacuum on the gauge, then I'm going to open my bleeder valve, you should again see the vacuum on here drop, but it will start to try to pull fluid through the system. And I can already see some bubbles coming out of there. And there's some fluid, so I'm going to go ahead and close this. And now I can take a look at my master cylinder, and you can see that the fluid has dropped significantly. So I need to go ahead and fill this back up. It's very, very important that you keep track of this. I'm going to go ahead and get this really full because I know I'm going to pull some through. Back at the bleeder valve, I've made sure that I've got vacuum in here, and I'm going to crack this open again. And my goal is to actually pull some fluid through into this container. But, as always, once the fluid starts moving, if you see a significant amount of fluid moving, then you're going to want to shut this off, close the bleeder valve, and check the level in your master cylinder again. In this case, it's actually fine, but since I'm up, I'm going to go ahead and top this off again. Once again, back at the bleeder valve, I've made sure I've got vacuum in here. I'm going to crack this open one more time. And what I'm trying to do is get maybe an inch of fluid, brake fluid, in this container, so I know I've moved plenty through the system. And I'm also looking for air bubbles to stop coming out of here. I'm not really seeing many air bubbles coming out now. So I'll go ahead and close this. Once again, back to the master cylinder. You can see the levels dropped, so I'm going to fill that up a little bit more. This time I'm not going to try to overfill it. And now I'm going to put at least part of my cap back on there. Now I'm going to pump the brake and see how this feels. And I can feel it pumping up. This may take a bit of pumping. You're going to have to move the piston out so that it's pushing up against the pads on the rotor. After some pumping, this feels firm enough that you could stop here if you wanted to. The brake would definitely work fine, and there is plenty of lever feel. I can't just pull it all the way to the bar easily, so I have no worry about my brake system function. I'm going to do the exact same thing that I've been doing to see if it firms it up anymore with another go at it. And I did get a few air bubbles out of here, so that may help. I actually repeated that process a few times just to be totally sure I was doing as much as I could with the vacuum bleeder system. And I've checked and topped off my master cylinder again. So, pump the brake a little bit. And I don't think I made a whole lot of progress. I believe it might have stiffened up just a tiny amount more, but it's actually a pretty good brake feel that I'd be happy with at this point. Now I can relieve the vacuum from my system and try to get this fluid moving away from the end of my hose here just so I don't spill much, and then go ahead and pop this off. At this point, if you wanted to wrap it up, you just make sure your bleeder valve is tight. I'll put the torque spec on here in case you want to check that. You would clean up any excess or any spillage that you've had here of brake fluid, and then put the cap back on. In my case, I'm actually not finished because I do want to show you what's probably the most traditional method of bleeding brakes, and it doesn't require any tools really aside from whatever wrench you need for the bleeder valve. For this method, once again, I'll put a wrench on my bleeder valve, and then I'm going to go back to my trusty soda can and piece of 3/16 PVC tubing. Now I've made sure that my reservoir is topped off with brake fluid. I've got my cap on there, and I'm going to pump up the lever. Now in this case, as you've seen, I've already bled the brakes another way. Normally if you're starting out, you're not going to get any pressure here, so you're just going to want to pump the lever maybe 10 to 20 times and then hold it. In this case, if you get some pressure, then pump it till you get pressure and then hold the lever. While still holding the lever, you're going to reach back to the bleeder and just open this up a little bit. Again, still holding the lever, and you're going to let the lever come down a little and then close it before it bottoms out. So I'm going to open this up, and that's going to relieve the pressure. My lever is going to sink down, and then I'll close it before it bottoms out. And you can see I pushed out a little bit of fluid there. Then what I would do is go back. You would always check to make sure this is topped off. And then you would pump this again. If you get any feeling, then go ahead and pump it up until it's as firm as it feels. Otherwise, pump it again 10 to 20 times. Hold the lever. Back here again to the bleeder. Open that up. And then stop. Close it off before your lever bottoms out. Then you'd come back, check your reservoir again, and keep repeating this process. And what you should see is that after a few tries, you start building up more and more pressure. You get a better and better lever feel, and eventually you'll get all the air bled out, and you should have a nice lever feel. When you're done, just like everything else, then you would go ahead and top off the master cylinder and put the cap back on. Even though I'm satisfied with my brake lever feel, I'll show you another trick that you should keep in your arsenal. A lot of people that do motorcycle brakes know this one, and a lot of people like this trick. So if you want the stiffest lever feel possible, after you've got all the air that you can get out of there by normal bleeding methods that I've just shown you, what a lot of people like to do is pump this a few times and then pull the lever in as much as you can reasonably. You don't want to put tons of pressure on here. And then use a bungee cord, or some people just use zip ties, cable ties, and wrap that around the lever and the bar. Now it's very easy. All you got to do is leave this alone for a while. So most people will tell you to leave it overnight. That's a great suggestion. That's what most of us do. You can leave it for 24 hours if you'd like. You could leave it for just a few hours, though I think it's more effective, or it seems more effective to me, if you give it plenty of time. So I would advise at least overnight. Just let it sit there. Don't touch it. I had some other stuff to catch up on, so it's been a couple of days before I got back to this, but I'm going to go ahead and unwrap this. It's not a huge difference, but it did stiffen it up a little bit. So now I'll need to take the cap off of my reservoir, make sure it's still topped off with fluid, and then I can call it done. Now I'm ready to start on my front brakes, but before I do, I want to do just like I did with the rear brakes and figure out where all of my hoses go. So in this case, it's actually easier because we have these two cables here that are shorter, are exactly the same. Then there's one longer cable, and I've got a little distribution block here. So what this does is, these are both from the distribution block to the calipers. One goes to each caliper, and then this goes from the distribution block to the master cylinder. In stock form, there's a very short hose attached to the master cylinder, and that leads to a metal brake line. The Malossi setup replaces this brake line as well as the hose that's up top by the master cylinder with a single braided stainless brake hose. Then they provide their own distribution block and a separate hose going out to each caliper. I'm not going to show you every detail of draining the front brake system because it's basically the same as draining the rear brake system. I'm going to pop off the cap of the master cylinder, and I'm going to suck the fluid out of there with a syringe. Then I'm going to go down to the bottom. I'm going to use my vacuum bleeder, and I'm going to try to pull the fluid out through the bleeder screws on the brake calipers. The main difference here is that this has two brake calipers, so I'm going to try to pull the fluid through the bleeder screw on each one. I'm going to start on the left caliper, but it really doesn't matter which one. I'm going to go ahead and clean off the area around my brake bleeder because there is a bit of dirt and grime on this thing, and I don't want any of that to find its way into the system. Same deal as with the back. I'm going to pump this up, get some vacuum in there, and then I'm going to open the bleeder, and hopefully we'll see some fluid coming out of there. Close it off, gonna pump it up again, and then open this up one more time. Moved over to the right front caliper, and I'm going to go through the same process. Again, I'm going to flip this upside down. That way it's the lowest point. I can get maybe a little more fluid out of there when I open it again. I can close it back off. And that's probably as much as I'm going to get out of there. On the right hose, I'm going to remove this clamp. And then I'll go ahead and take the hose off. Then I can totally remove the caliper. When that comes off, you should get a crush washer on each side of the brake hose. I'll be doing basically the same thing on this side, except over here on the right side, this clamp also holds the speedometer cable, so you don't need to totally remove that. You can if you want, it's up to you. I'm just going to leave it on the speedometer cable. And then I'll remove the hose. There's also a small plastic clamp to remove from around the brake hose on the left side. Actually, there are two of those little plastic clips on that side. Now I'm going to remove the splitter and the two hoses attached to it. So I'm going to take a 16mm wrench and hold the splitter itself, the body of it, while I use a 10mm wrench to loosen this top fitting. Okay, I think that's free, so I should be able to pull it up. There we go. Now I can remove this nut and the whole thing should come off. Now I've moved up to the top and I'm going to remove this bolt from the master cylinder, and I'm hoping that the hose and the line will all come out together. Now I'm going to try to figure out how to mount this little distribution block or splitter. So I was hoping, since this is a fairly expensive brake kit, that this was custom made and meant to bolt on here. But if it is, I don't really see where it's supposed to go. The hose that'll be coming down from the top has a 90-degree fitting on it, so it would appear that I should have this mounted so this faces out. That'll be where the one from the top goes, and then the others are facing the side. But obviously that's not going to work as the mount is. So what I'm thinking is, if I could just bend this mount up, that would give me the right angle to mount it. Then I just have to deal with how to actually mount it on this stud, because they cut it so it looks like a cap screw should go in there and a nut's not going to work. So what I'm thinking is I can get on the lathe and make a small adapter to go in there, and if it's a tight fit in here and comes up high enough, I can just use the original nut and mount it to this stud. Here's what I ended up with. On the bottom section, the outside diameter is pretty much exactly the same as the inside diameter on here. It's within a 1/1000th anyway. And the depth of that is just shy of the depth in here, that way it won't bottom out. And then this is as big as I can make it so that it actually fits without running into the body here, and it should be tall enough once it's in place that I can put a nut on there and it will sit over top of this so the nut won't interfere with it. So probably have to just tap that down or push it down hard. And now this sits just a bit taller than that, so you can see I don't have to worry about the size of this nut. It's not going to run into it. I'm going to put a couple of lines on here real quick just to make sure it looks like this should work. This seems to be secure, and it looks like everything should have clearance where it is, so I think this will work. I don't want to tighten the two lower hoses that go to the calipers just yet because I want the calipers in place before I do that so I can see how everything needs to be positioned. But nothing's going to change from this distribution block all the way up to the master cylinder now. So I'm going to leave this loose, and then I'm going to go ahead and install the other end on the master cylinder and then come back and tighten this up. This style of connector can rotate at the end, and it will do that until the very end is tightened against this nut here. But for now I'm just going to leave that a little bit loose so I can swivel, and I'm going to go ahead and mount it up just like all the other connections here. This is a 13mm fitting. This one is also a 13mm, and I'm going to hold this, try to hold this way into position because otherwise it will swivel, and I want it right about there if possible. Next, I'm going to replace the brake pads, the brake springs, and the brake caliper piston seals in each one of the calipers. I'm going to do them one at a time because it's easier that way for me, starting with the left-hand side. So the first thing I need to do is get the brake pads out of there. I need to be able to remove this pin that goes through both of the brake pads, and there's a little clip on each side of that needs to be removed. So in this case they're kind of spun around, so they're sort of hard to get to, but what I can do is just take a small screwdriver and I'm going to push this one down so it'll come off of that pin. Okay, there's one. And then I need to do the same thing for the one that's over here on this side. Now if they were facing upward, you could grab them with a pick and just pull them right out. Or you could try to rotate it around and see if you could get that so you could pull it out. But for me, it's just as easy just to push down on this and get it to fall out. And there's the other one. Now this pin needs to come out, so it's open on both ends. You can try just pushing from either end and slide that out of there. You can see once that pin's out, now my brake pads just fall out. Then I need to get the spring out of there, but before you do that, make sure you take a look at how that's oriented. So it's easy just to look at the front or where this bleeder is and see that you've got these two long pieces here that come up there, and just remember they've got a point at the bleeder valve. Then you should be able to just pull that out. If not, use a screwdriver and pry it out gently. Before I remove the pistons, I want to clean the caliper thoroughly. And I'm going to use brake parts cleaner and a brush. And before I even do that, I'm going to plug the hole where the brake bolt was, where the fitting was, with a rag, or a piece of paper towel actually, because I don't want to get a bunch of brake fluid inside of the caliper. I'm also going to clean these two clips and the pin. For the pin, I'm going to use a fine Scotch-Brite pad and go over it real quick. The caliper definitely isn't spotless, but at least it's clean enough that I know when I remove the brake pistons, a bunch of loose dirt is not going to fall in there. So now it's time to remove the pistons, and I'm going to try to do that with air pressure. So what I'm going to do is take an air gun and point that into this hole here where the brake hose was. And I'm hoping that the air will then force these pistons out. Now the problem is sometimes these pistons can come out with quite a bit of force. So normally I run my air pressure regulator at about 90 to 120 psi depending what I'm doing. But right now I've got it around 45 to 50 psi because I want to drop that back a little bit. And I'm not just going to hit it full blast right away. Also, you definitely don't want to try and get your fingers in there to catch these things. That could be very bad for you. So what I'm going to do is take a rag and stuff that in between the pistons. That'll give me a little bit of a cushion if they come out. And again, keep your hands clear. Now I'm going to push some air into here with my air gun. And you can see them pop out. I also forced some brake fluid out of there at myself, so be careful with that. Now they didn't pop all the way out because I think I've got a little bit too much rag in there. Alright, let's try this again. I'm going to put a rag up here so maybe it'll block some of the brake fluid. Okay, that one wants to come out. I'm going to push it back a little bit for now. Actually, both of these are pressing against each other, so that's okay. I just need the rear two to try and push out of there a little better than they are. Okay, there goes that one. And then this one down here still needs to come out, so for right now I'm going to see if I can push this one back in a little bit. That way it'll hold pressure and let it try to push that one out. Still, that one just wants to pop out. I'm going to push that all the way back. Then I'm going to use a screwdriver. Again, I don't want my hands in there. So I'm going to use a screwdriver and push on this piston, the one that keeps coming out, because I'm hoping that will allow this one to come out further. Let's see how this works. There we go. Okay. Now I'm just going to push this one in a little bit and then let it push both of these pistons out. So what I'm aiming for is to get all of them sort of equally out of there. I don't want one way back and the other way out because I probably can't get this thing out by hand. So what I'll do again is go back and put a rag between these two in the back. I'm going to push these out or in just a little tiny bit so I can get a rag in there. And then I want this one to stay in a little while this one comes out a bit more. So I'm just going to put a little bit of pressure on that with a screwdriver. See what happens. There we go. Now I'm going to be very gentle. Try to. There we go. Alright, let's see if I can get these moving back and forth. So hopefully you can get these to a point where they do want to move. Alright, there we go. So that one will move. I can pull the rag out. They'll all move. Alright, that's good. So now I'm going to push one side back just a little bit, enough that I can get these out because they can't be in the center and then come out. So I'll push this one back a little. That one might be far enough. Not quite. Push that back just a little bit. You can do it by hand. Just until I can get this one out of there. Okay, maybe. There we go. Alright, so this one's out. Then what I want to do is hold this thing so that I know exactly how it's positioned. So in my case, I'm going to set it so If it's sitting this way, this is the front, and it's right side up. This piston came from back here, what will be the rear left corner, so I'm going to put this down here as if it's in a rear left corner. Then I'm going to try to get one of the other pistons out. So now push this one back, pull it out. This would be my right front, so my little square pattern here, I'll set it up there. Alright, I've managed to get these moving by hand, so now I can take this one out and again set it upright facing forward, and I know that goes over here. And then I can try to get this one out. Okay, there it goes. Again, sit this in my little square so I know where it came from. There we go. Now I want to remove the seals, and there's 2 for each piston, so 8 total for each caliper. There's one up top of each one, right here. That's a dust seal. And then you can see this big line here. It doesn't even really look like a seal, but that is the actual caliper seal. And both of those you just need to pry out of there with either a small screwdriver or maybe a pick, but you got to be very careful not to scratch anything. There's the dust seal. Now let's see if I can get in there for the caliper seal. I'm going to try to use a pick for that. See if I can get that pried out a little bit. There we go. And then should be able to pull it up and out of there. And it'll be exactly the same process for every single piston. Finally, I'm going to remove the bleeder screw. Now I want to try to clean inside of every one of the passages where a piston was. I'm going to start just using a clean, dry paper towel. Now I'm going to continue cleaning. I'm going to put some fresh, clean DOT4 brake fluid, the same stuff I'm going to use when I put it back together. I'm putting that on a clean rag, and then I'm going to use that to clean inside of each one of these spots where a piston goes. The reason that you want to use brake fluid instead of brake parts cleaner is because brake parts cleaner is very tough on seals. Now I've got all these brake pistons to deal with, and you can see that they are pretty dirty, maybe corroded. I'm going to try and clean them up. I'm going to use a little bit of brake fluid, and I'm also going to use some 600 grit sandpaper and see how clean these things turn out where they've been exposed. All of these are cleaned up as good as I'm going to get them. They're not perfect. You can definitely see some pitting from rust, but to me they're okay. Now technically, anything like I just did where you had to sand it a little bit, by the book you should just replace all of these pistons, any piston that has that sort of damage. However, by the time I go over it and sand it, I'm not really removing any material, any of the outside diameter. I'm basically just smoothing it out a little bit and getting rid of the surface rust, and once I'm done you really can't feel it. Next I'm going to get ready to install my new seals. So you've probably noticed this already, but you've got small pistons and large pistons. The small ones go toward the rear of the caliper. So naturally you've got large and small seals in this kit, and one bag has all the large seals down here and one bag has all the small seals. So I'm just going to sort this out for what I need since this is for the entire front. So the dust seals will be the smallest ones in here, the thinnest. Caliper seals are these thick ones. So there's both of the rear pistons, and then for the front, same deal. Need 2 of the thin ones. and 2 of the thicker ones. Now I'm going to take one of the thick seals, those are the actual piston caliper seals, and lubricate that quickly, lightly with some brake fluid. Then I'm going to try to get that into one of those larger front holes, into the bottom slot. I'm going to start just trying to push that thing in there by hand, see how that does. So far not so good. Not sure how much you'll be able to see of this. Very hard to light this and to get a camera to look into there. But I'm getting it started down there. So I'm just going to try to work it all the way around into the groove. That one's seated. While I'm at it, since I've got brake fluid on my gloves, I'm going to go ahead and do all of the dust seals for all 4 pistons. Now the thinner seals, the dust seals that go up top, are next. With these, instead of brake fluid for lubricant, they tell you to use a silicone grease, brake grease like I showed you earlier. In this case, the kit that I got came with grease, and use this very sparingly, as you can tell by how much is in there. Just put a very light coat on each one of the seals before they go in. Just like the others, try to push the seal down in there, and if you can get it started in the groove, then you just sort of work it the rest of the way around until it all seats. Unfortunately for me, this is always easier said than done because of gloves. It'd be a lot easier barehanded, but you definitely don't want your bare hands in a bunch of brake fluid. Actually, that one didn't go too bad. That one's in. After getting those seals started, hopefully the pistons will seem easy. So first, I'm just going to lubricate the outside of that with a little bit of brake fluid. If you want, you can also lubricate the inside of the seals with some brake fluid to help you out. And then make sure you've got the piston that goes into each spot. So remember, you were supposed to be keeping track of which piston came from where. This is where it pays off. So I know that this piston came out of this exact hole, and that's where I want to put it back. So I'm just going to set that over there and try to get it centered. And then start to press down on it. Try to work it in. You want to be gentle because you don't want to push these seals out. There we go. Okay, so now it's started, and then I'm just going to push it all the way down till it's flush with the side of the caliper here. Now for the next, I've already smeared the brake fluid on there, and it's going to be the same process as the other. Trying to keep that straight. There it goes. I'll push it all the way down until it's flush. And just continue doing this till you finish the whole caliper. All the pistons are now installed and sitting flush, but I've got brake fluid all over the caliper and I don't want that all over the place. So I'm going to go ahead and just use some basic cleaner and degreaser and wipe this thing off. Now I'm going to install the new bleeder valve that came with the brake seal kit. Before I do that, I've just got to put this little rubber cap on there, slide it up over the threads on the bottom. And I'm not worried about any torque spec because I'll have to go through a brake filling and bleeding process anyway. Just going to snug it for right now. Next up will be a new spring and new brake pads. Both sides of the front brake pads are the same, so you don't have to worry about where they go in the caliper as long as the friction material is facing the center. I'll start off by installing this brake spring, but before I do that, I'm going to use a little bit of silicone brake lubricant, just like I did with the rear brakes. I'm going to put a very thin coating on the underside of this. Now I can lay this on top of the caliper and you have to make sure the orientation is correct when you do this. So these two tabs here should be facing the front, facing the bleeder screw. The brake pin is going to have to go through the caliper, through the pins, and through both brake pads. I'm also going to put a little bit of this silicone lubricant on the pin as well. Again, a very thin coat. And I'll prep my brake pads too. I'm going to put lubricant on the back of those. Notice I'm being very careful not to touch the friction material with my gloves since I have had lubricant on there. I also want to get just the very edges here and all around the top. Again, if you get anything on the friction material, make sure you clean that off. Now I'm going to take both of my brake pads and face their friction materials to each other, just like this. What I need to do is get these slid up from the bottom of the caliper here until these two holes align with the spot here where the pin will go through and through the clip. Then once those are aligned, I need to get the pin slid through all of those things. So I think it's going to be easier for me just to sort of hold this pin in place and hold this upside down at first. And I will drop these in. I'm actually going to drop one on each side. Now I'm holding the brake pads up from the bottom, and they're a bit too high now, but that lets you see. These tabs on the brake pads are aligned with the clip here where there's a passageway, and also you can see that they will be aligned with where the passage is for the pin on the caliper. So now I just need to get them back down into the right position. Also, I should note there's a little divider here for the two brake pads. Just make sure one brake pad is on this side and one is on that side. So now I need to get those into the proper position so everything lines up. I'm going to go ahead and start my pin to make it easier. And then I'll just start sliding that through, and you may have to kind of work the brake pads up or down to get that aligned. Now if you look at this divider that I was just talking about, it's got a valley in there, and the pin needs to go right over top of that valley. You don't want the pin to be below this little divider, you want it to sit over top of it. So when you're trying to push the pin through, you're going to have to put pressure down on this clip to try and get the pin to ride over top of that. And it may take some alignment of everything. Okay, see that's going over top of that little divider. And then finally, I need to get the pin the rest of the way through my other brake pad and then through this side of the caliper. Again, you may have to fiddle with it a little bit to get it aligned. I can kind of look in this hole and see that my alignment is off. The pin needs to move down. So I'm going to put a little pressure on the top of it here and see if I can get that through the rest of the way. In fact, I'm going to use a little screwdriver to guide it. Just want to be careful if you're doing something like this. You don't want to put pressure on that clip or bend it. I'm just trying to touch the pin itself and align it with that hole and not damage anything in the process. There we go, now it's aligned. I can push it through till it's flush, or basically flush. They'll set just a little bit out on each side, not very much. So now I can look in here and see that my brake pads are secure and my clip is still in the proper position and the pin is all the way through everything where it should be. Now I need to get these two little clips installed so that it secures the pin. So if you look inside there, you can see, I hope you can see on the camera, that there is a little hole that's visible right there between the pad and the caliper. If you can't see that, I guess take my word for it, there is a little hole on each one. And I just need to get my pins installed through those holes. If the holes aren't facing a direction where you think you can get a pin through, you might be able to take a small pick and put it in the hole and just kind of rotate the pin around that way. Just going to take this, get it aligned, and then push it down into there. Same thing on the other side. Now you can see those installed, but they're sticking up a bit. I don't like to leave them sticking up. I don't know that it would really matter, but I just take a screwdriver and rotate that pin around so that they're not sitting up above the caliper. And finally, I'll flip this over and then I'm just going to move these brake pads out to the outer edges. This caliper is ready to go back on the bike now. You can handle this however you'd like. If you prefer, you can take the other caliper apart now, rebuild it, or replace the pads, whatever you're going to do, and get that ready. Or in my case, what I would prefer to do now is I'm going to take this over to the scooter, go ahead and get it installed, and install the brake hose on this side. That way one side is complete, and then I'll do the other side. When installing the caliper on this side, there are a couple things I need to pay attention to. First off is this little holder here, this little bracket that goes on the speed sensor cable. That needs to sit over top of this mount here, the lower mount on the fork. Then on the top, I've also got a reflector, and that's got to sit over that and align with a hole, and that'll get bolted on with the brake as well. I've got my caliper, the pads are spread apart, and I'm going to slide those pads over top of the brake rotor so they go around it, and then work this up into position so that these two holes are aligned. And I can try to start my lower screw again through this little bracket here and the shock or the fork and into the caliper. There's a bracket on the speedometer cable that should also have a brake hose going through there. So I'm going to pull my brake hose over. I've got that attached at the distribution block loosely. And I'm going to put that around the grommet on the brake hose. Then I'll go ahead and install that right here on the shock. Now I can install the hose, so just like everything else, I've got one crush washer on the bolt, and I'll slide that through the end of the fitting. Then I'll put another crush washer on the other side, and then I can install this into the caliper. A little higher up there are these two clips that help to secure the cable to the brake hose. But these are way too big for these small brake hoses, so you could go out and try to find grommets or some sort of sleeve to fit those. I'm going to go ahead and remove these, and I will just replace those with cable ties or zip ties to keep that cable in place next to my brake hose. The only thing left to finish up this side of the front brake is to tighten this fitting. Cleaning and servicing the caliper on the other side is exactly the same process, so I won't go into any detail here. I do want to show you one thing that I didn't show you before, and that is a way to hopefully not spray out so much brake fluid like I did last time. So there's this port on the side, and when I tried to push air in, it was pushing brake fluid out. But what I didn't do before I started last time was push these pistons all the way in. So what I'm going to try to do is hold this so that this port is facing down and push these pistons all the way in as far as they'll go, and maybe that will push more of the brake fluid out and save me from having it spray out on me later. Yep, see how I'm squirting the brake fluid out now onto paper towels instead of all over myself. do you think? Is this cheating? Bleeding the front and rear brake systems is essentially the same, with one major difference, and that is that the front has 2 brake calipers where the rear only has 1. So I've got 2 bleeder screws, 2 spots to bleed versus 1. Now, traditionally, if you have a caliper that is further away from the master cylinder, then you will start there. The way this system is plumbed, both have an equal length of hose going to each caliper. So they're both equidistant from the master cylinder, and it really shouldn't matter which one you start with. The main thing is, once you get one bled out and you're not seeing a bunch of air bubbles come out of there, move over to the other side and bleed the other one. If you can't get all of the air bubbles out, then you may have to kind of go back and forth until you do. I moved over here because it seemed like there were way too many air bubbles coming out of the other side and it wasn't changing. I also noticed that vacuum was dropping on my vacuum bleeder much more quickly than it should. So when I got over here, I realized that vacuum is still dropping, and it's dropping even with the bleeder closed. Then I realized that I've got air bubbles coming out of the bleeder valve even with the bleeder valve closed. And you may notice this is a different hose than I started with. I started off with this yellow tubing. This is a little bit tighter, so I put that on there thinking maybe I had leaks around where the tubing meets up to the bleeder valve, but obviously that's not the case. This is very tight. If I open this up, again, you'll see that there's a bunch of air in there. I'm getting much more air than fluid. It's now closed off, and if I pump the vacuum back up, you can see again something's moving through there while the bleeder valve is closed. So at this point, my best guess is that I must have leaking bleeder valves. These are the aftermarket ones that came with the brake seal kit. They're a little bit different design than the others, so I'm thinking maybe they're just not sealing. I changed out both bleeders, and still tons of air comes out with a vacuum bleeder, and it leaks even when each bleeder valve is closed. So I was hoping maybe it was the taper that just wasn't sealing, but it appears that it's not sealing around the threads. So I'm going to take both of these back out, and I'm going to apply some Teflon or PTFE tape. Now, I don't particularly like the idea of having to do that, but I'm going to try to be careful with it, and hopefully none of that will get into the system. I can't see any other way that I'm going to use the vacuum bleeder. The other option would be just trying to switch to another bleeding method. So I could do what I showed you earlier with just pumping the brakes or something like that, or you could take a syringe and reverse bleed it by pushing fluid in. You fill a syringe with brake fluid, crack the bleeder, and push the fluid in through the bleeder valve and up through the rest of the system. But I'd really like to use the vacuum bleeder, so I'm going to try a little bit of Teflon tape here. What I'm going to do is kind of fold this to make it a little thinner, and I'm going to try to keep it up closer to the top of the threads because I really don't want this to end up in the brake system. The higher I can keep it up there, the more chance I've got that it seals without ending up in the brake fluid at any point. And I'm giving it plenty of wraps because I know that I'm going to have to open and close this. There's one. Now it's retaining pressure, so it appears that the problem was indeed that it's just leaking around the threads. It seemed to solve the problem on this side as well, so now I'm going to go fill the master cylinder and retry bleeding the brakes. That looks much better. Notice the vacuum isn't dropping very quickly, and I'm seeing a much more solid stream of brake fluid. The right side bleeder valve still has a small amount of air that's getting in there when it's open. It seals when closed, but when it's open it lets a little bit of air through. So that one took a little more effort than it should have probably. I could have went back, taken the bleeder out, and redone the whole thing and tried to get it to seal, but a little extra effort and it seems to be fine. Now I've got a good lever feel. I'm going to use my trick again overnight. I'll pull this tight to the bar and wrap it up with a bungee cord and let that do its work, and most likely I'll have an excellent feel after that. Before I move on, I want to give you a couple of quick tips about tools and supplies used during bleeding your brakes. So first off, these are the rags that I used that got quite a good bit of brake fluid on some of them. I never want to use them again. Normally I will wash or clean my rags and reuse them. But with this brake fluid on there, I don't want to take any chance that I possibly put brake fluid onto a paint job or a powder coated wheel or something like that. So these will be thrown right in the trash can. As for the tools, I would suggest that anything that you got brake fluid on, make sure you clean it thoroughly. It's honestly a good practice to clean your tools anyway before you put them away, but definitely if you've got brake fluid on them, give them some general purpose degreaser and cleaner and wipe them down good before you put them away. We're almost done now, but we've got a couple of quick tests to take care of while we're doing this major service. So the first one is we want to lubricate the pivot shafts on the brake levers. So all we've got to do that, you can see we've got a large flathead screw head here, and on the underside of that is a 10mm socket, or 10mm nut I should say. Just go ahead and loosen that nut and remove it. Then unscrew this. Once you get that all the way out of the threads, hold on to your lever. You can pull that pin out, and then you should be able to carefully remove your lever. Now I've got some old grease and a little bit of dirt and grime in this area, as well as on this little rod, so I'm going to spray some general purpose cleaner and degreaser in there. And then I'll just go over it with a nice soft toothbrush and get that all cleaned up. Same deal for the lever, general purpose cleaner degreaser. Clean that as well as the pin. You will want to give special attention to two areas. One is this little cup here, that's where that rod goes in to operate the master cylinder. That one you should be able to just clean with a toothbrush. And also make sure the inside of this passage is very clean. So again, general purpose cleaner degreaser. And what's helpful to me is having a pipe cleaner there. Just run that through there and get it all cleaned out. Now that those are clean, I'm going to go ahead and lubricate them, and I'm going to use the same stuff that you saw me use on other braking parts, and that's my silicone brake lubricant. So I want to get it on this section, the shaft here of this bolt, and I also want to get it inside there where that bolt passes through that pin. And you may want to put a little bit on the top and a little bit on the bottom there, and I also want to put some right inside of this cup. If you'd like, you can also put it on the rod directly that I showed you earlier. So for getting it inside of there, it may be helpful to have a small brush These come in handy for a lot of stuff. You can just kind of work it in that way. You don't need a whole lot, and you definitely don't want a whole lot here on the outside, but just get a thin coating. Trying to get that big glob out. Okay, then a little bit on here. I'll put a little squirt of grease inside of that cup. Kind of work it in. And then I can wipe off the excess from around the outside. And I'll put a little here just for good measure, as well as inside there. To reinstall this, I'm going to slide this in. You got to be careful to get this little rod inside of that cup. So kind of push it in this way and work it into position. Get that hole aligned. And you can take the bolt pin, put that through there, and then screw it in. Now there's a nut that goes on the bottom of that. Thread that on and torque the nut to 6 Newton meters. Before you move on, make sure your lever works well and operates smoothly. You can hear the switch in there engaging the brake switch, but it's a good idea to check and make sure your brake lights actually illuminate when you use the lever. Both levers are exactly the same, so just repeat the process on the other side. Alright, I think we're finally there, the end of the video. Before I do close this video out, first off, I mentioned that there was a bolt in the Malossi brake hose kit that had a different thread, and I never did see anywhere where that goes, so I assume that must be sort of a universal thing to make this kit work with other scooters or other motorcycles. Also, I didn't mention, after you get your brake hoses installed, and once they're bled out, pump everything up and take a good look around and make sure there are no leaks. You're probably going to know if there are leaks when you're bleeding the brakes, because if you can't get them bled out, something's probably leaking. But even if you do, get them pumped up and take a good look, make sure there's no brake fluid leaking from anything. With that said, thank you very much for watching. I know it's been a long video, but I really wanted to include all of this information in one place and allow people to just use the chapters to skip around and find whatever you would need if you're working on the brakes of your TMAX. If you've enjoyed the video or found it helpful, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more and click the bell for notifications. Thanks again.